Buonasera a tutti da Roma all'Accademia Americana. Siamo felici di avervi qui e se per Zoom. Good evening to all from Rome. My name is Avinoam Shalem and I'm the director of the American Academy in Rome. I'm very happy to welcome you all here per Zoom to our conversation with our residents, the Louis Kahn residents for this spring, Rebecca Zorak and with Nicole Marroquin, who is an artist and educator. And by that, I'm passing the word to our art director, Elizabeth. Please, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Avinoam. Good evening, everyone from Rome, where I'm really pleased to be hosting this transatlantic conversation. In this case, we're bridging Rome and Chicago, which are two of my very favorite cities. I'm Elizabeth Rodini. I'm the Andrew High School Arts Director at the American Academy in Rome. And I believe I'm moderating today's conversation partly because of my longtime Chicago connections. I've actually known one of our participants, Rebecca Zorak, since graduate student days in Hyde Park. And it's really great to have her with us in Rome now. Today we're going to be considering the Chicago Muralists, a group of artists of the late 1960s, and in particular the Wall of Fame that was painted on the corner of 43rd Street and Langley Avenue in 1967. Rebecca Zorak and Nicole Marroquin are going to dive into this project to think about how it and other related initiatives might be understood as productive elements of the urban civic fabric. They're wondering things like, can we see these elements as something more than symbols of identity, but instead as actors that shape cities and how people live within them? Or how activist can such activist art projects be with regard to the urban experience? And these are really important topics within this year's theme at the American Academy, which is the theme of the city. And they also feel very timely as we come off of, or we continue to live through, a year of intense urban protests in the United States, which in some cases have resulted in their own artistic interventions, including murals. And as you'll see, Rebecca and Nicole are an ideal pair to dig into these matters, and I want to get right to them now. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll move directly to our program, which will consist of a presentation by each of them, and then a chance for some discussion along with questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A and feel free to do that as we move along. We're going to start with Rebecca Zorak, who is presently the Louis Kahn resident in the history of art and architecture in the history of art at the American Academy in Rome. In her day job, she is Mary Jane Crow Professor of Art and Art History at Northwestern University. Previously, she was on the faculty of the University of Chicago, from which she received her PhD. She's the recipient of numerous honors, awards, and fellowships from the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, as well as the Fulbright, Mellon, and Luce Foundations. She was the Clark Professor at Williams College in 2014, and Robert Lehman Visiting Professor at Harvard's Villa Itati in Florence in 2019. Her books and other publications are numerous, including Blood, Ink, Milk, Gold, Embodied Experience in the French Renaissance of 2005, The Virtual Tourist in Renaissance Rome, Printing and Collecting the Speculum Romani Magnificentiae, which was also an exhibition at the University of Chicago Libraries in 2008, and Art for People's Sake, Artists and Community in Black Chicago, 1956 to 1975 in 2019. This last title may seem like the outlier here, but in fact, it's really at the core of much of Rebecca's current work, which we could summarize as art, politics, and urban space, a triad that she really extends from Renaissance Europe to the contemporary American city. Nicole Marroquin is an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and educator whose work explores belonging and spatial justice through the investigation of student rebellions in the Chicago public schools between 1968 and 1980. Through her research and creative practice, she gathers and presents histories of BIPOC youth and women's leadership in the struggle for justice in Chicago. And for our Italian audience, I should note BIPOC is an acronym you may be hearing tonight, standing for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Nicole has recently been an artist in residence at, among other places, the Chicago Cultural Center and Oxbow, and has presented projects at the annual conference of the American Association of Research Librarians, the University of Maine, the New School, Jane Addams Hull House Museum, the Kochi Biennial, the University of Illinois, University of Pittsburgh, and Northwestern University. Nicole's essays are included in the Virtual Art Research Journal, Counter Signals, the Chicago Social Practice History Series, Revista Contratiempo, and Where the Future Came From. She is a Sor Juana Inez de la Cruz Women of Excellence awardee, a member of the Just Seeds and Chicago ACT artist collectives, and on the faculty at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So a lot of deep Chicago experience in both of our speakers. And I think we'll start now with Rebecca.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And could I have the first slide? Thank you. So thank you to Avinoam and to Elizabeth. And I just have to thank the American Academy in Rome for the opportunity to be here, which I'm very excited about. And for this opportunity to talk to Nicole Marroquin, who I've known for a long time as well, not quite as long as I've known Elizabeth, but I really admire Nicole greatly as an artist, an educator, and a researcher. And I also have to thank many, many other people who've contributed to this research. I'm going to be talking about materials that are based in work that I've done over the past few years on Chicago and Chicago murals. But many, many, many people have contributed to this, and I want to thank in particular the co-editors of a book that I co-edited on the Wall of Respect. The Wall of Respect, Public Art and Black Liberation in 1960s Chicago, and the co-editors are Abdul Al-Kalamat and Romy Crawford, both of whom have taught me a great deal about Chicago and about murals. So I'll also refer to the acknowledgements of that book for a full list of all the people I need to thank for kind of helping both to make these incredible artworks and to help make the research possible. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Wall of Respect and a few other murals made in Chicago in the late 1960s and early 1970s that are part of a history of mural making and community political action in Black Chicago in that time period. The Wall of Respect is considered the first Black community mural, meaning it's not the first mural by a Black artist by any means, but it's the first that was by a group of artists, a collective of artists known as the Obasi Visual Artists Workshop, created in public on the street with the intended audience of the community, the local community who lived in the neighborhood. It's a wall of Black heroes and heroines in 7 different areas of excellence: politics, sports, jazz music, R&B music, religion, literature, and theater. And it was created by a group of painters and photographers working together who are known as the Obasi Visual Artists Workshop. And it was made in 1967 as a collaboration among these artists, also with a lot of contributions by the local community. It was created in an economically depressed neighborhood in Bronzeville, which is an area of Chicago on the south side, which was the historical kind of site of migration for African Americans coming to Chicago from the South during what's known as the Great Migration. Could I have the next slide? And I will talk a little bit about the Great Migration shortly, but it was also, the Wall of Respect was also part of a broader Black arts movement. I'm giving you a little bit of a sense of the kind of overall sense of the Mid-South Side, where the Wall of Respect and many other arts institutions were created by Black artists during the 1960s and 70s. So this is just kind of a schematic map of culturally significant spaces on the South Side of Chicago that are part of the Black arts movement, which was also part of the Black liberation movement of the later 1960s, building on the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the earlier 1960s. And one of the things I think is important to point out is that art was really, among other things, a way of creating Black visibility in these spaces, in neighborhoods where African Americans in Chicago were fighting to stay and also fighting to have a place in neighborhoods where they had not historically lived and were trying to move into, in a situation of segregation, different from the segregation that took place in the South, but still a very segregated residential life in Chicago. So could I have the next slide? And just to give you a sense of a few Black art spaces that are not murals, but these are galleries, studios that were created by and for Black artists in the 1960s and 1970s. So could I have the next slide? Okay, so just to give a little bit of background, I mentioned the Great Migration. There's a large Black population in Chicago, the result of expanded migration from the South that occurred beginning in the early 20th century and continuing in successive waves of migration through up until today, really, but in particular around World War I, following World War II, up until the 1970s. And this was a migration that occurred as African Americans from southern states migrated north, seeking jobs, seeking relative freedom. The situation in Chicago and in other northern cities was not paradise by any means, but it promised relative freedom from the legal segregation and the Jim Crow violence of the South. People came for jobs. They came in large part because they read about the availability of jobs in northern cities in the Chicago Defender, in particularly for Chicago, a Black-owned newspaper that brought word of what kinds of things were available in Chicago to the South, following train lines that you can see in the image on the left. And the image on the right shows you readership of the Chicago Defender in the South in the time period of the Great Migration. Could I have the next slide, please? So housing segregation in Chicago. So in the North, segregation was not a matter of laws in the same sense that it was in the southern states, but it was enforced by groups of white homeowners largely and landlords, creating something called racially restrictive covenants, which prohibited landlords from renting to Black tenants and prohibited homeowners from selling to Black buyers. These were covenants that were created by whites who organized themselves formally and informally to create deed restrictions on the property that they owned. This is something that changed over the middle of the 20th century as a series of Supreme Court decisions struck down racially restrictive covenants, and one of the decisions was the Hansberry decision, which you can see in the newspaper on the right. This is the headline is in the Chicago Defender. And this is a court case that was based on the experience of the family of the playwright Lorraine Hansberry, which she chronicles in Raisin in the Sun. And this is something that, so over the middle of the 20th century, African Americans began to face fewer legal restrictions on where they could live in the city of Chicago. And you're seeing in the first map on the left, the dark area in the mid-south side is the area historically known as the Black Belt, where African Americans first began moving to Chicago and then increasingly were restricted as these racially restrictive covenants were put into place. There's a new set of problems that African Americans faced in housing following the Great Depression, where the Federal Housing Administration enforced rules about who could, about where people could get mortgages. This is the practice known as redlining, which you can see in the map in the middle. And the areas in red were considered kind of off limits in terms of the ability for people to get mortgages, because the Federal Housing Administration would not insure mortgages in those areas because the Black populations and populations of other people of color were considered too prevalent in those areas by the federal government. So it's a very racist government imposed restriction on where people could own homes. Could I have the next slide? So this is kind of the larger context of what's going on in Chicago as African Americans are seeking both to maintain their neighborhoods that they've traditionally lived in by the later 1960s, which are starting to be kind of falling victim to this whole history of kind of disinvestment and systematic underdevelopment of Black neighborhoods in the city. There's a kind of decline in housing stock, loss of jobs, and people, African Americans in Bronzeville, are trying to hang on to the sense of this area as a Black neighborhood with a lot of Black history in it. At the same time, also trying to move to other parts of the city where historically they had been prevented from moving. So in both cases, there's a sense of trying to create visibility, to take a stand, to preserve a neighborhood and to preserve a community in a neighborhood, and also to produce new forms of visibility in new neighborhoods that they're trying to move into. So I need to get a little bit further ahead in my notes. Okay, so the Wall of Respect and another mural called the Wall of Truth, which was opposite it, were in an area in which the city was taking an active interest in seizing and demolishing residential property. So there was really a need to kind of maintain a sense of ownership over space, whether actual ownership or kind of symbolic ownership over space. Could I have the next slide? Okay, so this is one of the things that's happening in another kind of layer of this was really a transfer of wealth from Black populations to white populations happening over the middle of the 20th century is urban renewal. And this is large scale demolitions of residential housing in order to create these large developments on behalf of whether it's a kind of suburbanized housing or public housing projects, high-rise public housing projects, or large institutions creating space for themselves by tearing down residential tracts that were considered blighted. So this is something that's happening in the mid-20th century in Chicago, often public-private partnerships by which residential real estate is torn down and redeveloped. You can see in the middle map, the red star is the approximate location of the Wall of Respect and the Wall of Truth. And you can see that it's surrounded by urban renewal sites where there's large scale demolition happening. There was also small scale demolition happening. So individual buildings were threatened with demolition by urban renewal as well. But the ones you can see are the very large ones that displaced thousands and thousands of people from the south side, also from the north side and the near west side. So there are a lot of different urban renewal projects happening at the same time. These are, I mean, kind of interestingly, the fact of urban renewal and of demolition is something that makes certain kinds of walls in the city available to be painted on. But then also the fact of that kind of intervention is something that then allowed artists to rally community members to try to save neighborhoods. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is something that you can really see in images around the Wall of Respect that are really images of an activated community, people gathering at different kinds of events or gathering informally around the wall. And you can see two of those images on the left. Something that photographers really emphasized in their images of the Wall of Respect are the community around the wall. So it's a sort of sense of a community becoming activated, or actually multiple communities becoming activated, because there's the community of artists, there's also the community of neighborhood residents, people gathering and just as the Wall of Respect is making Blackness visible in the neighborhood, the people gathering are making themselves visible as Black people in the neighborhood. On the right-hand side, you can see a couple of other instances of people being activated in one way or another. The little boy on in the upper image is giving a tour to visitors, people who come by and wanted to find out who the figures are on the mural, and he would charge $0.25, and multiple kids in the neighborhood would charge $0.25 to tell visitors who the people were who were depicted on the wall. Then below is Eddie Harris's Blackmobile, a kind of mobile Wall of Respect that he created, inspired by the Wall of Respect. He painted figures on his car who represented some of the same important Black historical figures and contemporary figures as the ones who are on the wall. Could I have the next slide? So the Wall of Truth opposite the Wall of Respect really explicitly posed itself as a mode of preservation for the community. We, the people of this community, claim this building in order to preserve what is ours. And could I have the next slide, which takes up the sign again, you'll see. So there are a lot of things that happen around the wall of respect and the wall of truth, which again, were opposite one another. Both of the buildings are threatened by demolition, and both eventually were demolished, but a lot of people rallied to try to save them. The business owners, you can see in the article in the middle, business owners rallied to try to preserve the wall of respect in particular, and to try to use it as the basis for a community center. And you can see in the article on the right, the question of conflict and struggle, that murals are specifically being understood as part of a battle of the walls. So the idea of murals being used to try to preserve buildings and to preserve neighborhoods, and then authorities responding in various ways to try to prevent that. The poet Donnell Lee also referred to the wall as a weapon, the wall, the weapon. So a weapon of Black liberation, but also in this kind of more concrete local way, a weapon of preservation of a community. Could I have the next slide? Okay, so just quickly, I want to just quickly go through a few other aspects of what murals are doing. One of them is presenting information, community information, serving as a kind of rotating newspaper. The wall of truth in the image on the left, you can see has various different posters, newspaper pages, flyers, brochures that have been wheat pasted to it. And in this kind of ever-changing newspaper for the community, sort of in a similar way to storefronts that are used to represent both news and figures, important figures of Black liberation, as in the Umoja Black Student Center storefront, which you can see in the lower right. Could I have the next slide? Community collaboration. So we could see that a little bit with the wall of respect, with the relationship to the community, and community members did make interventions onto the wall and suggested changes for the wall. This Art and Soul is a interesting collaboration that took place between the Museum of Contemporary Art and a group known as the Conservative Vice Lords, a street gang turned community community organizers. So this was a collaboration between these two groups, kind of in a similar moment to where we are today, with institutions kind of scrambling to respond to urban uprising by creating new forms of collaboration and trying to give new attention in some ways that work, in some ways that don't work, to, in this particular case, Black youth on the west side of Chicago. But the image on the right is significant because this is a mural created by the second director of Art and Soul. So this gallery that was the collaboration between the MCA and the Vice Lords. Don McIlvaine, this is what you're seeing in color in the inset, is a film clip in which he's explaining some of the figures on the wall that he's painting to a boy who's clearly not versed in Black history. And McIlvaine is kind of using the wall as a way of teaching him about Frederick Douglass and other figures of Black history, making the point also that Black history is not being taught in schools. And this is something that students, including high school students as well as college students, were agitating for and doing a lot of activism around the teaching of Black history in schools. Could I have the next slide? Okay, and so collaboration with young people, I showed the image on the right a minute or two ago. It's also, one other thing that you can notice in it is the easels. So these easels were set up so that young people could make sketches that would then be transferred to the mural. So this is very much a collaboration with young people in the neighborhood, something you also see in another of Don McIlvaine's murals on the left with young people who are painting on it. Could I have the next slide? So this is the Alley, which was an informal music venue in Washington Park, another South Side neighborhood, which had murals on either side of this alley, which was a kind of informal gathering space and music venue where people played records and there were live music sets on weekends. And people gathered. It's very similar to the way in which they gathered around the Wall of Respect, but it was a kind of weekly happening over and over and over again, in which eventually photographers came and started taking pictures of people in the community who were there, and then would come back a week later to post the photos, the prints of the photos they had made on a wall, on a nearby wall, so that people could really see themselves. So images, photos taken of people who were enjoying the music and hanging out in the space would then get recirculated as images on the wall, creating a kind of community wall of respect that's really about people in the neighborhood and not just about famous figures who are being represented on the Wall of Respect. And this is a photograph that you can see on the right of a group of kids who are really mugging for the camera and trying to have their picture taken so that they too can appear on the wall. Can I have the next slide? So this is my final slide coming up. So I just wanted to kind of throw in questions of destruction and preservation. The image on the far left is William Walker's piece in Salvation, The Wall of Understanding, which was painted in 1970 and whitewashed in 1991. This was painted near the housing project Cabrini Green, and actually inspired a young woman who lived in the neighborhood to create the other mural that you see on the lower, on the right, but the lower right. Vanita Green created a kind of wall of respect of Black women in particular, but it was immediately vandalized, and she retitled it Racism after it was vandalized. It gives you a sense of the kind of, I think generally speaking, murals are preserved from graffiti. They often are not graffitied or not vandalized at least in the sort of early years. As they deteriorate, however, over time, they're ephemeral, they're exposed to the elements, and things you know, there are kind of various questions of preservation that arise. A lot of William Walker's murals, and he was one of the key artists of the Wall of Respect, are gone now, and many have been whitewashed, including recently. So the All of Mankind, which you see above, also in the area around Cabrini Green, was whitewashed in 2015, so quite recently, as part of gentrification that was occurring in that part of the city. I think the Vanita Green's mural is a really great instance of someone, a young person in the community who sees a muralist creating a monumental mural. A Peace and Salvation is a huge mural and really Walker's masterpiece, but she was inspired to create one of her own. You know, it also then raises questions about what it takes to preserve murals. Their artists often thought of them as artworks that were intended to be constantly changing, not necessarily intended to be preserved for a long time, but they then, as they become historical, become important to more people beyond simply the artist. And I think that's, you know, something that's become a kind of rallying point for a lot of neighborhoods, is to preserve murals that are there, that are historic. And so this, you know, raises interesting questions about what we do now with murals. And I think perhaps Nicole will pick up on some of these issues in terms of the kind of situation of the present. So as we turn over to Nicole, I think there's a film we're going to show next.
This is Marta Collazo. We're both poets from Chicago. And this is a poem for Pilsen. I wrote this when I was living here last year. And it's dedicated to Pilsen and the Plan 21 program. All right. Late night sounds and smells entice, and we prowl like cats through Pilsen sidewalk and alleys. The night wind scatters paper and other debris like malignant leaves through the gutters, and broken glass glitter like old discarded jewels under the harsh street lights, turning vacant lots into family treasure chests. Families all gather on the front stoops, cooling their hot and tired bodies in the night air, watching the wet children run in the spray of the pumps while Santana blasts from the car radios of the dude who's dancing plays to the music, embroidering colorful stories, punctuating every other motherfucker with a drag from a cigarette and a gulp of cold beer, coolly eyeing the traffic passing by. A sweet mariachi melody drifts out from a bar on the corner, wrapping eyes in silken strands of harmonies, and a longing beats itself against the ribs, threatening to break out to you. They say you're a slum, Pilsen. Mexican barrio, a halfway house for the upwardly mobile, a dumping ground for the terminal souls that look for hope in a fix or a bottle. You are redlined in the sleek polyestered offices in downtown, talking shit about you being a high-risk area, and yet the pimps in Gang 21 are busy making plans to dress you up and sell you to the Johns that are bored of suburban living, wanting excitement without sacrificing convenience. Your past crumbles in ruins along the tracks that twist through your heart like steel veins, and deep rumbles of the elevated trains echo the unrest in the minds of the soon-to-be displaced, their anger and pride splashed in violent colors, trying vainly to hide the decaying walls, and the long dead painted heroes call silently for revolution. Night surrenders to the gold streaks on the horizon, washing the old buildings in its pale light. Blaring car horns splinter the morning stillness, and the pulse of your lifeblood quickens as the men in dark clothes and the patient women huddle like quiet flocks of blackbirds, waiting for the buses to take them to the slaughterhouse of color-blind greed that will decide your future, Pilsen.
We're selling some t-shirts, Mujeres t-shirts that come with the...
All right, I'm gonna take it from here. So that was a poem by Salima Rivera, who was reading in 1979 at an event for Mujeres Latinas en Acción. And I come to this, to murals from looking at like school uprisings. I'm a teacher educator and I'm an artist. And the footage that we're looking at right now is of protests that happened in this really small neighborhood I'm going to talk about during this really narrow time period I'm focusing on. The print that I made here is about student protests that were happening, and this is actual footage of students marching and protesting from the same neighborhood. In 1968 through 1973, students were protesting incredible problems with their high school. They were marching every Monday in 1968 to demand college preparation courses, instructors that were able to teach Black history and Latin American history. These protests were led by Black students, and in September, and then in October, Latin American students joined them. And the image that is sort of at the center of this print is of police officers attacking students when they were meeting together during a peaceful protest in their lunchroom. So I'm coming at this from being incredibly interested in the way that protest and the murals work together, but I'm also really influenced by the aesthetics of some of the murals. And so I'm really just looking at and talking about a really small area. The areas in green on this map are areas that Mexicans migrated to over, the course of about 100 years. And they were present in Chicago in like the 1880s, but came in larger numbers in the 1920s to come to the steel mills, which you see at the south, and then in the central area to the meat packing factories, in back of the yards, and also to the railroads. And the area that's outlined in pink, in the very center of the whole city here, is this really tiny area called Pilsen. And the murals I'm going to talk about are just sort of, I highlighted this line in bright blue to show there's this little tiny street called 18th Street, and it's within about a block of almost every single mural I'm going to talk about right now. And I'm going to be talking about people who call themselves, depending on what year it is, either Mexican or Mexican American or Chicano or Latin American or Latino. In this map here, for example, they're called Spanish origin in 1980 or Latinx. And this matters because before 1972, Mexican and Mexican American students in Chicago public schools were actually counted as white. Statistically, they showed up as being white. So as Mexicans, they were invisible, which is why it was impossible for them to demand equal access to education because they were invisible. They blended in. And so, for example, during the Harrison High School protests for that poster, I first came to this and got really interested in it because I heard that Mexicans at that time had an 80% dropout rate, right? There were no Spanish-speaking teachers at this school, and it was the school that had the majority of Pilsen residents. So right around this time also, the first mural painted in this neighborhood and painted by a Mexican-American person in Chicago as part of this movement was painted right by 18th Street by Mario Castillo. And so a really important part of the movement was centered in a place called the Casa Aztlán, which had been a neighborhood settlement house for many years before that. And it was called the Howell Neighborhood House or the Bethlehem Center. And settlement houses are throughout Chicago, could be found throughout Chicago. And they were places where immigrants were able to sort of acclimate, find assistance. They had clinics. Sometimes they were orphanages. Sometimes they provided social space for people in the neighborhoods. But around 1970, Mexicans became the majority in this neighborhood of Pilsen. And this is when it sort of changed hands and became the Casa Aztlán. And you can see that it changed regularly. It sort of evolved along with the community and the community's needs. But in addition to that, like the murals changed. And there were murals on the outside and murals on the inside. And both of these photos, I want to point out, were taken by people who also taught at the Casa Aztlán. They were muralists. Diana Solis actually took this photo of students that were in her photography class at the Casa Aztlán. And Ray Patlan, who took this photo, was one of the muralists who painted what you see on the inside. And this is a picture of people in a dance class. So they had dance, music, and art classes, citizenship classes. There was a child care center, a library, like a miniature Chicago public library. There was organizing space provided to networks of community organizers, everything from weddings and parties. And another thing that's important to know about the murals here, and these are two artists that were working out of the Casa Aztlán, Mario Castillo and Ray Patlan, is the community mural movement was not sort of, I guess, typical if you think about the art world, right? People were invited to participate. People in the neighborhood, young people, people who didn't paint, people who didn't know how to paint, they would actually learn by participating. And the reason for this was because above having a singular artistic vision, there was sort of a collective impulse to create something that people would then feel ownership over. And so this is what the murals look like when they're completed, just so you know. So when you're seeing these murals, you're looking at like the sort of the collective work of many, many people over a little bit longer. It takes a little bit longer to paint a mural like this. And so the murals actually, even the Casa Aztlán were continuously repainted, and youth were part of this. And so also on the inside of Casa Aslan, like I mentioned, it was completely painted. And so Casa Aslan was also central to school organizing. Parents were able to use that space to voice their concerns about the schools, the lack of Spanish language instruction for the students. And on the right is a poster I made that actually is prints on top of a photo that I found on eBay about a history I had not heard of before about a massive student walkout and protest. But another issue, and this was the concern of students at the time and is a concern right now, is the presence of police in schools and police violence against young people. And so while these murals were being painted, there was also these mass movements and mobilizations of students protesting the conditions in the schools. And the murals reflected this. And so on this side, on the left side, it says in Spanish, we organize ourselves all together, Chicanos, Mexicanos, Puerto Ricans, Central and South Americans, and education for every student in the neighborhood. And so schools were looked at as community hubs, and people were investing in their children and investing in their neighborhoods by repairing their homes, as seen in this mural by Bill Campillo. There were also, photographs were part of this too. This really interesting story I had been hearing for years, and I just now saw pictures of it. Diana Solis actually documented this as well in 1987. But there was a barber shop that people have spoken about for years. And I just put some sort of, reproductions of some of the photos that could be seen, that I can see from this picture, that were on the wall, that were facing the window. So this history of Mexican people was not being taught in the schools, right? So it wasn't just that language wasn't being addressed, but these schools that were almost entirely Mexican students or entirely Mexican students didn't have people that were, didn't have teachers that were speaking Spanish, but also didn't teach the culture that they were part of. And so one way people would learn about it was actually walking by this barber shop and looking in the windows. And just less than a block away, like if you were to turn your head just slightly from this barber shop, is this mural that was painted in the early 80s by Hector Duarte. And you can see Emiliano Zapata in the mural. And that's a mural about housing. And so people were learning their history from this, right? And on the right, you can see this sort of dilapidated mural that has recently been sort of a center of attention, where people are learning this history of this remarkable person named David Gonzalez, also known as Boogie. And in 1973, he was killed. The reason why he was commemorated here is because he had been a peacekeeper. He was a very young person and had worked with factions of youth that were fighting, having continuous gun battles and fighting over areas of the neighborhood. And he called them together and said, we need to unite for the good of our people. And so this history was actually preserved here on this mural, and it's made its way back into the news. And if this mural wasn't here, it likely would not have happened. And so the muralists were organizing inside of their communities for justice with people in the community, and then also organizing against outside factions. And so in the upper left-hand corner is actually a picture of 3 muralists who had gone downtown to the Art Institute of Chicago to protest during a College Art Association conference in 1976. And in the upper right is a mural that was painted by young people with Ray Patlan. And in the image, he shows a figure in blue handing guns and death and heroin out. And Ray Patlan said that this was sort of a reference to what the young people who helped him paint this mural told him, was that police were providing guns and heroin and harming the neighborhood. And another mural he painted with young people depicting leaders in Mexico and Puerto Rico was actually painted with Mexican and Puerto Rican youth in the neighborhood. And he was trying to teach them history through the act of painting and to show them how they needed to get along better. And so the battle for better schools, eventually, I'm collapsing a lot of history here, led to a new school being built. And the Benito Juarez High School, which was inaugurated in 1977, eventually there was a mural generated through much debate in the neighborhood. And the muralists who led this effort, Malu Ortega and Jaime Longoria, painted with many muralists from the neighborhood. But like, for example, Malu was actually an art educator at the Casa Aztlán and also ran the ceramic studio there. So all of these pieces are really intertwined. And just sort of to wrap this up and connect it back to housing, in both of these murals, there are sort of these clan hooded figures in the middle of these sort of what looks like arguments with the people, right? Like in one, it's, you know, a clan member with a pile of money and a skull. And this other one, it's, you know, a gun and a skeleton and a clan member facing the neighborhood who are saying things like affordable housing now in Pilsen. And stop the gentrification in Pilsen. So displacement is the line between displacement and racist violence is really direct, the way that it's being depicted in these murals. And as Salima Rivera mentioned, you know, the Chicago 21 plan actually was a plan that would have affected all of Chicago, but it would have had an extremely negative effect on the neighborhood of Pilsen. It would have completely redeveloped it and displaced all the folks. And that actually was a unifying battle. And in the end, there are still murals being painted, and there are people continuously addressing social issues on 18th Street. Gabriel Villa painted this in about 2016, and it's got very familiar looking, you know, Pilsen houses, right? And implanted on top of them are hooded figures in hoodies, kind of like referencing the young person who was murdered, Trayvon Martin. And also on the bottom right is a mural that was on the Casa Aztlán, Pilsen is not for sale. But eventually Casa Aztlán closed in 2014 and the murals were painted over in 2019. And since then it has been redeveloped and it's condos now. And so things are still active. These are young people at the Chicago History Museum protesting the lack of exhibitions of the history of Latinx Chicago people. And Sammy Rivera says, imagine how many younger kids came and didn't think that their history and culture was valuable because they didn't see it represented here. So the battle is still on for representation and visibility. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Nicole. It was great to see some of those images and just the many ways these things functioned in these neighborhoods. I found really interesting as kind of forms of education and beautification and teaching painting. I mean, the multifaceted valences of the projects are really interesting. I'd like to invite people to put questions in the Q&A. They are starting to come in, so I will do my best to field those. I did find actually incredibly moving the poem that you transitioned between your presentations with. I love the idea of a poem to a neighborhood. I mean, that was just incredibly powerful, and to see, and it really shows us the kind of activity that was going around these spaces. So I thought that was really great. Let's see. We do have some questions that are starting to come in. Someone asked about, I think this is an interesting question, a historian kind of question, about where you get the sort of documentation that you use, because there are some amazing images there, photographs of kids giving a tour. Where does some of that material come from? Where do you find it? Because it's not the sort of thing we might typically find in the archive. Is it the Chicago Defender that you're going to? Or what are some of the sources you're using?
Well, I could start quickly. A lot of it is interviews and conversations with artists and people who were there. So there's a really strong component of oral history, and having people. It's just like, you know, part of the whole movement was about people telling their own stories, and so being able to have that be part of how these things are interpreted is really important. Then there are newspaper archives. There are flyers and things in people's personal archives. A lot of it, you know, the photographers' archives, which include both their, you know, negatives and contact sheets and prints, and then also records they kept and records that other artists kept and people who were involved. So there are some things that are, you know, found in places like the Southside Community Art Center's archive or some specialized archives in Chicago, but a lot of it really is from people who were there.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I actually showed a couple of images that Ray Batlan either gave me or shared on social media, and then I asked him if I could use them. But then also I've been working on the collection of the artist Diana Solis, who is a longtime Pilsenite who has incredible documentation of a lot of this. She was involved in murals then as a student, but now is actually a muralist, and also, like, her photos are an incredible document of like an intimate history of Pilsen.
No, I mean, it really gets to the issue of, you know, how these things come into, or when they would come into any sort of canon of art history, right? And collecting the kind of ephemera and documentation that goes around those sorts of artworks. So that's something I'm really interested in, and maybe you could just briefly address, you know, the attention that these sorts of things have gotten in among more traditional art historical narratives, be they in classrooms or textbooks or you know, monographs. Are these things that art historians are introducing into the conversation, or it's sort of kept in a separate pocket of interpretation? I don't know if either, Rebecca, can you answer that? As someone who
I was typing an answer to a question as you were talking.
Oh, sorry. I was just asking about the canon of art history and how these are, if they're being brought into it. I mean, thinking about the collecting of materials that supports the study of these things made me think, who's studying them? I mean, you are, but are they entering a broader conversation?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think like I think it is really important that murals have been very neglected by art historians and art critics, and for many different reasons. Because they're collective, they're done with communities, they're often done with and by and for children, and you know, all of these things are kind of like, you know, devalued in art history. And I think that one of the things that's lost is the importance of the process, because I think murals, and you know, a few people have started to kind of make this point, that murals in terms of their process and their community involvement really are the progenitor of social practice art as we know it today, as a kind of art world trend, which, you know, has like various sides to it. But I think that it's something that they really do need more attention. And the comment that I was responding to in the Q&A was about CETA funding, which also produced a lot of murals as well. And there are questions about the sort of official nature of some certain murals. Like I think some art historians or art critics get uncomfortable when there's public funding for artworks. And although it doesn't seem to be as much of a problem for the WPA, it does seem to be a problem with, and it does, there are issues with when does it become official art, and kind of how to understand the relationship between the different ideologies that are at stake and how the negotiations happen. But that's the stuff of it. That's that's something that really needs more research. So I do think that things are changing and murals are getting more attention. But I think it's something that it has traditionally been a problem in our history that in art criticism that they've been kind of disparaged and not fully addressed.
Yeah. So there are a couple questions that kind of bounce off that, and we're running close to our time, but I wanted to try and get both of these in. Miguel de Baca asks about gentrification in the south and west sides of Chicago and how that's impacted the proliferation of murals or the conservation of older murals, or the increase in decorative murals in other parts of the city. How are those things coming together or clashing, and how does that impact what's happening to these artworks?
Nicole, do you want to
talk about that?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a tough one. It's controversial, right? Some of the historic murals have been sort of rehabbed, and repainted. Not quite restoration in the way that I think art historians would say it. But at the same time, there has been a really recent and renewed interest in the history of some of these murals, and people stepping up to try to understand them and to write about them. I'm thinking particularly of some journalists that are addressing them, and also people on private property owners, people on whose buildings these murals are painted are hearing from neighborhoods that these need to be, not just covered up. And at the same time, they disappear. But the question of decorative murals and whether they sort of what role they play in development and gentrification, that is definitely a conversation to have, a long one.
And I can just throw something in. That's also a conversation that the artists were having in the 1970s. The idea of there were muralists who were part of the early Chicago Mural group, which later became the Chicago Public Art Group, who were saying, if I want to paint a flower, I'm going to paint a flower. And but then also contending with muralists who maybe wanted actually a more political intervention than what members of the community wanted, and having to kind of negotiate that and think about what are we actually going to produce here. So it's a lot of player when it becomes a collaboration, then when it becomes a kind of authentic collaboration with the community, then artists have to kind of, if they're giving over some agency, sometimes it makes for something that's actually more hard hitting and more political, and sometimes it makes for something that's maybe not as much so in the way that the artist might have imagined it.
Can I ask one last question? Because a couple of people have asked about this, and that's sort of the status of these things in terms of official preservation within the city of Chicago. If some of them have received kind of official status as landmark, how the city has been involved in we're talking more about the popular interventions, but kind of official approaches to the longevity, the future of these. And I'm sure that the answer is not uniform, but maybe there's an interesting example or two you could share with us.
Well, I think Daniel Schulman is maybe still here, and he might be able to help us with that. I think Chicago has historically not protected its murals all that well, and a lot, has not been a kind of systematic public art policy. I mean, I think that's in the process of being developed, and it's one that's also being addressed with respect to problematic monuments that are currently kind of under discussion. But I think that the Chicago Public Art Group has done a lot of really wonderful preservation of murals as a matter of often partnerships with local institutions, the aldermen of different wards. It's often very kind of individual, what gets preserved and what doesn't, what gets restored and what doesn't, as a matter of like the Chicago Public Art Group deciding like something is a priority for often for very good reasons, but then like having to find funding for it and having to find the buy-in from the various stakeholders.
Right. Well, we always talk about Chicago, a city of neighborhoods. So that somehow sums up maybe the city's approach to these things as well. We're really up against our time, and I know, people have busy days, and in Chicago, it's just hitting noon. So I think we need to wrap up, but I thank both of you so much for taking this time to share your knowledge and thoughts about these really interesting projects. And we will save these questions and pass some of them on to you that we were not able to answer, and maybe we can try and get back to people. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending, and have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. Buonanotte, buona serata.